Hello everyone, so this is the final video that I'm doing for you on Cambodia, and it's actually the final video of the course. Towards the end of this video, I will talk to you about your essay that you need to do on Cambodia. But let's begin. Let's begin with the next story in sequence, which is Starship. There is a metaphor inside this title, and I'm wondering if you can sort of unpack it and make sense of it. I suppose, in a sense, what we're asking is, how does this, which is clearly the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, how does that connect with this? JFK and his son, JFK Jr., in a very touching and poignant photograph, I think. How do they connect? Well, think about the word star. What might a star be if it's not in the sky? And the answer is, of course, a celebrity. And you can see how this story is now developing the Out of the Diamond story and the theme of celebrity in that story. And I suppose, how do these two images connect that I've shown you? It's this idea that what goes up must come down. You send a rocket up into the sky and something's going to come back down, and so it is with our celebrities. I suppose this is Fawcett's idea. We build them up, and then we will deliberately take them down again. There is a kind of poignant aftermath to this story. Let me just show you this picture again. So, you know about the assassination of JFK, of course you do. The little boy here, his son, was killed in a plane crash in 1999, many years after Cambodia was written. The circumstances are tragic. I mean, he was flying his wife and one other person to Martha's Vineyard, a small light aircraft, and investigators subsequently found that he was flying upside down. There is a phenomenon known to pilots when you fly over water at dusk. You can very quickly become disorientated. And it looks as though that's exactly what happened, and he pushed the stick up, but actually was going into the water. So that was a tragic death, and indeed so many of them were for the Kennedy family. It's quite extraordinary. Kennedy's elder brother Joe died in the war in a plane crash. His sister died in a plane crash in 1948. Of course, his brother, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated. Robert Kennedy's son, I think, was killed in a skiing accident. Robert Kennedy's granddaughter was killed only a few weeks ago in a tragic accident at sea. She took a boat out with a young child, and they both drowned. My goodness, what an awful collation of events. Anyway, hopefully you get the kind of connection here. I think more generally, what Fawcett is suggesting in this story is that if the medium of politics becomes entertainment, then that is how we will start to engage with the political. So why talk about entertainment when I mention the Kennedys, or when Kennedy shows up in the story? It's because the Kennedy presidency was, if you like, the first soap opera presidency. You had a charismatic, intelligent, good-looking guy in the White House with a very interesting, charismatic family. You had connections to the Rat Pack, to Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, the rest of them. You had murky connections with the mob. You had the Marilyn Monroe affair. glamorous women going in one side of the White House, coming out the other side of the White House. It was that sort of thing. Um, and I think the conflation of politics and entertainment is something that concerned Fawcett back in the 1980s. And it makes me think that this is just another way in which the book is arguably more relevant today than it was when it was written. After all, when it is actually difficult to distinguish what's going on Saturday Night Live with what's going on in the Oval Office, look where we've arrived. Yeah? So, the other aspect of this is that entertainment doesn't just mean something that amuses us or makes us laugh. It can be something that excites us and titillates us in a much darker sense. On page 38, subtext, Fawcett writes, "You and I, reader, live in a world in which the average 15-year-old has seen thousands of people die every day, as it were, and all for the same reason. It's dramatic logic. There's a dramatic logic that requires this. So, if we take a presidency, a president, and we create out of that a soap opera, effectively, then there is a kind of dramatic logic that requires the protagonist to die violently. That's why there are crosshairs in the imagination of the narrator here, in the sort of camera lens. Kennedy has to die, and die spectacularly. We've all watched soap operas, right? I'm not sure if we're all going to admit to it, but we all have. And think about it. I mean, the protagonist in a soap opera never die. If they do die, they never die in their beds quietly so that we're just told about it. It's always a dramatic and violent death, and so it must be for Kennedy. And I think that's the basic point here. The more profound point, perhaps, is the idea that the medium itself is becoming the message. Content is getting lost. Policy is getting lost. It's all about appearance and superficiality. The medium itself. There's a clear indication of this in the story. Page 170. Fawcett, or the narrator here, is talking about these repetitive images of the explosion of the shuttle. And he says, "I was fascinated, who wasn't? But the longer I watched, the more I started seeing things I don't think I was supposed to. It was like I was looking through the television set and seeing how the television system was shaping the story, connecting it to parts of the public psyche and disconnecting it from others, turning it into something it wasn't in the beginning." And so here it is. It's this idea of the medium itself becoming the message. Across the page, halfway down, I even thought about why nobody cares about those kinds of deaths the way they used to. I got an ugly answer back, because there are no television cameras there to film the dying. So the sense here is that reality itself is becoming just reported reality, an image of reality. The medium is the message. This, of course, takes us to Marshall McLuhan, because that's his phrase, which he came up with in his book Understanding Media in 1964, as well as the metaphor of the global village. Later on, he kind of reconfigured it as the medium is the massage, and wrote more about that. I think perhaps, well, not a more important book, but an equally important book by McLuhan is one that came out 2 years earlier, 1962, called the Gutenberg Galaxy. Johannes Gutenberg, died in 1468 and is credited with inventing the printing press, or movable type, shall we say. I've read that the Chinese got there a long time before, no surprise there. But anyway, Gutenberg is credited with that invention. So, in the Gutenberg Galaxy, McLuhan sets out almost an episodic history based upon inventions in communications and communications technology. So it sort of begins with tribal pre-alphabet culture and how that operated. Then he looks at alphabet culture, and then he moves on to printing culture, and then electronic media culture. And in each case, he's kind of exploring how communications technology and the developments affect cognitive organization and behavior. The section on the printing media and printing culture is fascinating. I was talking to you in the previous video, I think, about how individualism is a fairly recent invention. The sense in which we think of ourselves now as individuals is a sort of early modern invention of the 16th, 17th century, and certainly not the way people thought about themselves and identified themselves in the ancient world. If we ask ourselves about why that happened or how it happened, I mean, we will look at certain philosophers like John Locke and Hobbes and so on, Adam Smith and Hume and so on. And there are many reasons for why this happens, but McLuhan takes us to one of the important reasons, which is the creation of printing. So think of it like this. Prior to the 15th century, the invention of the printing press, it was difficult and expensive to write, to copy anything, which in a sense meant that printed material and all that pertains to that was basically in the control of two parties, the church and the monarch. They controlled, in a sense, what people read, because Joe Blow could not afford a scribe, even the ink and the paper, right? So the first thing that happens, very, very quickly, is the dissemination of cheap, easily reproduced texts, which empowers people, the citizens. It takes power away, shall we put it like that, from the church and from the state, from the monarch, to a considerable degree. And the other thing it does is that it starts a process where people start to identify themselves and distinguish themselves as different from other people in terms of what they have read. Where I come from back in England, we still have this notion that when you go to university, you read something. So you're reading philosophy, you're reading literature, you're reading biology, whatever. But it captures this idea that I'm different from you and you are different from him or her or whatever, because of the knowledge you have, which is part of your identity, and that comes from what you have read. And so society starts to separate out, shall we say, starts to form around individuals having these different capabilities. I mean, there are many other aspects of this that are truly fascinating. McLuhan talks about the way that we start to think in linear fashions, because the word becomes visual rather than oral. So I will leave that for you to explore if you want to, but it is truly fascinating. And of course, writing as he is in 1962, when he moves towards the end of the book to electronic media and culture, he's sort of working with fairly limited materials as we would understand today. You know, there's television, there's you know, you get it. There's sort of early telecommunications technology out there for him to write about. But he does, and subsequently he starts to anticipate where we are today with our global internet. The question, I think, raised by McLuhan is, does the evolution of electronic media lead to a sort of heightened individualism, or is it leading us into the creation of a new tribal consciousness? I mean, I think that's the question he's asking. And I think he is equivocal, not quite sure, and why would he be? Because he's writing in the 60s, 70s, and he dies in 1980. But by the time we get to 1986 and the writing of this book, we're presented with a writer who has a very clear answer to that question. For Fawcett, the evolution of electronic media, the global village, has created a new tribe of dumbed down idiots. And that is the Huxleyites. Now, you don't have to agree at all, but it's quite clear. That's what I think Fawcett is saying. Page 195 subtext will be helpful to you there. I don't want to go there now because I took you there last time, but we can go to 56 subtext. Yeah, so he says that McLuhan, for all his glib brilliance, didn't understand that the global village was going to be Los Angeles, where the majority of television programming originates. Nor did he understand what every amateur computer programmer knows, that the quality of information produced by electronic systems is totally dependent on the quality of information originally provided to them and on the quality and intonation of the intention of the data processing. On the one hand, garbage in, garbage out. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up what I'm saying on this story, I mean, I hope now you kind of get it. You probably did anyway. But you know, we have a narrator here who reminds us of Leonard and the guy in the chicken story. You know, he doesn't quite fit in. He seems a bit weird, even mad. But I think Fawcett's suggestion is that this is what enables him to see through the bullshit, right? So, and so we have this story. But the story also asks us, I think, to just explore the medium itself and its primary property, which is visual. The global village lives on, depends on the visual image, whether it be the photograph or the digital image. And I think it's worth just thinking about that for a moment. Let's imagine a photograph, or how photographs or images operate in our lives today. Let's think about the positives and the negatives, if I can put it like that. So what are the positive things about photographs and digital images? I mean, we can list them, can't we? We can come up with all sorts of things that are good about them, quite apart from the fact that they're entertaining. They are memory devices. That's how you use your camera, isn't it? Pretty much all the time. Whenever something happens that you think is amusing or unusual, the first thing you do is click, and then you're sharing it. So, you know, They're memory devices, and these are important. We all have parents, grandparents with photo albums, and we like to look at them. This is how we connect with our ancestors. So yeah, that's important, and that's good. Um, we have photographs which confer identity. So you are all carrying passports or IDs which have your photograph, and this is one of the ways in which we can identify who we are. They are creative too. They can be creative. I mean, if you go back to chemical printing of images and production of images, you can explore surrealism and Man Ray and all these wonderful experiments that were done to produce the most beautiful images, which are still photographs, right? And today, you mess around with Photoshop or whatever, and you can add things and change things, and you are being creative. And I think that's a good thing. That they are informative. Of course, photographs inform, and they're essential for research and for news and dissemination of news. And yeah, I mean, fundamentally important for communication nowadays too. So lots of good things, right? And you might think that Fawcett tends to ignore nearly all of these good things. I might agree with you. If he can beef about something, he will. And maybe that's one of the problems with this book. I don't know. That's for you to decide. But if we turn to the negative aspects of photography and the digital image, the not good ones, well, they're all over this book, aren't they? I mean, that's essentially what the book is asking us to consider. So we have photographs that can be used to target and to deceive and to conceal. I mean, you're standing there at the checkout in Safeway or Save-On or wherever, and you're looking at these silly magazines, and suddenly you find yourself looking at, I don't know, Britney Spears' cellulite. But you don't even know if it is, right? But what does she feel about that? And how would you feel about that? And so we have photographs as weapons now, which also takes us to the notion of ownership. Who controls the image? There's a wonderful book I need to tell you about. It's called Camera Lucida. Came out in 1980 by Roland Barthes. Very short and lovely to read. It's easy to read. Great for the beach, right? If you're just interested in this sort of stuff. But he talks about the essence of the photograph, the eidos, as being death. I've got the quote here, which I'll just give to you. He says, when I am photographed, he says, I'm neither subject nor object, but a subject who feels he is becoming an object. This is a microversion of death. It's a fascinating thought. Perhaps you can think of a time when somebody's taken a photograph of you and you're just like, oh, you just feel kind of icky about it. And if you do, or ever have done, it's probably because you were feeling exactly what Barthes has just referred to. The sense that the photographer has just taken something from you and you'll never get it back. And moreover, it's not yours anymore. It belongs to them, or at least they have control of it for the time being. So yeah, I mean, isn't that fascinating? And when I think about the Khmer Rouge, I have this thought too. I mean, I mentioned briefly a moment ago how one of the good things about photographs is the way that they can confer identity. So let's imagine a little passport photograph of you, and we stick it on the wall behind me, and there you are, right? I mean, everybody can see that's you. But But now imagine that on this wall and on all the surrounding walls, I have all these different passport photographs of all of you and thousands of you all around the rooms here. And then in big bold letters above, I put enemies of the state. And look what's happened to you. Firstly, you're lost in this sea of images. And secondly, you've been labeled. And perhaps that's what was going on when the Khmer Rouge took photographs of their victims and put them up on the walls in Chol Sleng in the prison, which Fawcett, of course, writes about in the subtext. One of the reasons I'm talking about this to you is that it might help you sort of string some of these stories together. If we take, for example, Crowd Control and Hinton, then I think both these stories are thematically dealing with those properties of the image which deceive and conceal. If we go to the Diamond story and the Starship story, then I think we are dealing with how identity conflates into image, becomes just an image. My celebrity appearance is now who I am for Reggie Jackson or Kennedy or whoever. And then if we get to Huxley, we arrive at the consumer of the image and what it does to them. And I suppose you can segue from there to the Fat Family, this idea of just constant pursuit of appetite, of feeding, of gorging on the image. It doesn't have to be donuts, it's the image that characterizes us. Okay, let's move on. So let's turn to the Swan and Leda. Kind of a weird story, isn't it, when you first read it? But I think it kind of makes sense and does tie into what Fawcett is talking about elsewhere. So we have a myth. Leda was Queen of Sparta, married to Tyndareus, and found herself engaged with a swan. So Zeus, God, well, how can I put it? Liked to get his leg over pretty much whenever he could, by all accounts, and would take whatever form suited him at the time. So forms himself into a swan and copulates with Leda. And this, right from the start, takes us to the different messages or different myths here, different types of story, because in some stories or accounts this is a rape, in other stories this is consensual. And the confusion abounds because subsequent to that copulation, in some accounts, Leda copulates with her husband, Tyndareus, and the result is progeny, children, Helen and Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra, I've already talked to you about. She features in Aeschylus's The Oresteia, if you remember. So she marries Agamemnon, Greek commander. He sacrifices their daughter, Iphigenia, before he goes off to fight the Trojan War. She takes a lover while he's away. He comes back. She kills him. Her son kills her, and you end up with the Oresteia. The other child is Helen, who is Helen of Troy. And of course, it's her union with Paris which causes the whole nonsense in the first place, the whole Trojan War. And one of the arguments that we have mythically is whether these two children are demigods, fathered by Zeus, or fathered later that day by the mere mortal Tyndareus. Okay, let me show you extraordinary painting by Peter Paul Rubens. This was done in 1602, and that's his representation of this copulation. The story takes us to another representation, which is a poem by W.B. Yeats. Do you remember I gave you a little poem by him? It was when I was, can't remember, but the thing about the balloon of the mind, that was a little sort of piece of doggerel he came up with. This is Yeats at his best, arguably. My goodness me. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Well, I don't know about you, but I think that's a terrific poem. But needless to say, Fawcett has a problem with it. He's got a problem with everything, right? So what does he have to say about this poem? Page 178. Let's go back to Mr. Yeats. Some part of his poem are correct. He was correct in thinking that swans are capable of having sexual intercourse with human beings. I didn't know that. Did you? I mean, see what you learn in English 100, yeah? Okay, so cross the page. So let's get back to Yeats and his telling of the tale. It's in his depiction of the coupling of God and woman that Mr. Yeats loses control of his materials. So we can accept for the sake of the tale that Zeus conceived a divine passion for Leda, but I figure Leda must have fallen for the swan. And so he's sort of arguing with the way that Yeats is pushing this together, which is what we have over the next 2 pages at the bottom of 180. It's revealing that the Greeks have argued bitterly over every aspect of the story, which is what I was mentioning to you. And now we get to page 182. Below the bullet point on 182, the Greek message is always the same. Life resonates. And we are inevitably, unalterably part of those resonances if we look and listen carefully enough. One of the things I like about myth, says Fawcett, is that it isn't just a commercial medium. When we talk in mythic terms, no matter what we do, we are within a continuum of events that links us in a common narrative. So he acknowledges that it's all a bit sketchy and confusing. And at the bottom here, he says, so, you're not sure what I'm talking about, so let's just try this. Imagine a woman you see walking along the street. She's slight, she's stooped, perhaps 30-ish. She's staggering, and she's got black eyes, and seems to be grinning almost idiotically. So what would you do if you saw that woman? You would go through a rationalization of what you're seeing and come up with an explanation. So perhaps she's on her way to a centre for battered women. Perhaps she's drunk, or perhaps she's just, put a hatchet in the head of a deserving husband. Maybe she's just bombed out on tranquilizers or whatever. Or perhaps, guess what? She just made love to a swan. because that's where we wouldn't go anymore. We wouldn't even think of that in an abstract sense. And so that's his argument with Yeats at the bottom of 183. Writing more than half a century ago, Yeats still believed that a reasonable and grand and connected order was at the heart of human existence, a cosmology. So for him, Zeus was the personification of all of that, a benign, kind, good magnificence that drew some of the animal violence out of the planet by means of a grand scheme to diffuse brute chaos and then to give it structure. And all else that was good for Yeats followed from that impulse towards order. So it's that sort of rational enlightenment approach that Fawcett is sort of rejecting here. What he says here at the bottom is that the Greeks didn't try to create so absolute an order by their speculations and tales. Instead, they observed, they talked, and they cherished the multiplicity and apparent confusion of the world without pushing it all the way to a kind of abstract order that Yeats craved. And I think this sets up the ending of this story. We have this guy who, well, at the beginning of the story, he falls in love with the swan, but why not? And at the end, we have this weird guy who goes into the water, seems to do something naughty with a swan and kills it. It's a swan killer. But Fawcett's point is that when we find out about that on the local news, it will be sort of between the sport and the weather as a human interest story, and basically it will be couched in terms of, here's a maniac. This is crazy people. There it is. He's obviously deranged or whatever. And there would be no attempt to explore it in a more metaphorical, abstract way. This is how Fawcett is nostalgic for a lost world of metaphors. And to connect this to the subtext, look at the bottom here on page 186. Right now, the difficult questions are getting lost because in the global village, explanations are all you get. And the explanations are meant to bemuse and titillate, not to produce comprehension. Comprehension creates memory, and memory has been marked for extermination. And 182. The craziest people in the world are logical. Governments have become even more logical. And they enact the twisted assumptions behind their logic, and that's all. Ultimate questions are neither asked nor answered. Okay, so I think sketched out like that, it's a pretty straightforward story. And it raises the question of whether we should share in Fawcett's nostalgia. We turn now to the final story. The Fat Family Goes to the World's Fair, a story that most of my students write on in their essay. Key to opening up this story is the notion of journey. And one journey in particular I'm going to take you to. This is the Cambodia handout that I've put on eLearn for you. And here's Joseph Conrad. You can see all the page numbers here where he's referred to in the book. Most famous perhaps for a short novel called The Heart of Darkness, the story of a man venturing into the Congo in search of a wayward collie called Kurtz, who is found, established in his own world, his self-made fiefdom, a brutal regime organized around worshipping the man himself. He's a megalomaniac. And I've invited you to check out Coppola's Apocalypse Now, the movie based on this book and updated to the Vietnam War. Absolutely extraordinary movie. Excuse me. It won, I think, several Oscars. And Fawcett refers to this film in the subtext. at the end of the book and the film, we have this encounter between Marlowe and Kurtz, and the final lines, the horror, the horror. In the story, it seems as though it is Fawcett traveling with his friend Howard on a train, encounter the Fat Family. One of them asks, "What's your name?" And I think it's Howard who replies, "Oh, it's Joseph Conrad." And so you can see how in the story itself we're invited to make this connection with the Heart of Darkness. And by the way, this story is very personal because in the preface to the book, you will see that this story is dedicated to the memory of Howard Broomfield, who was a friend of Fawcett's. I think they were both at SFU doing English together in the 1980s. And indeed, Howard got a job at Vancouver Expo and, overcome by the horror of it, committed suicide. That was his response to the horror. Fawcett's response was to write this book. Here is Vancouver Expo 1986. So that's the terminus point. In many ways, of course, it's a physical representation of the global village, isn't it? Because you've got all these pavilions of different countries around the world assembled in one place. So there's that going on. We need to connect this story to Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. So how might we do that? I think some students struggle with that, but I think the idea is this. For Fawcett, what happened in Cambodia was that people had their individuality ripped out of them, taken from them per force. The Fat Family have, on the other hand, voluntarily given up their individuality, ceded it, just given up, in pursuit of the next donut, the next titillation, in pursuit of appetite, whatever is going to be exciting and amusing in the moment. And that's why they are so viciously lampooned in this story. They're not individuals anymore. They carry around their dolls, their Cabbage Patch dolls, almost as though they're sort of supplements of personality. It's kind of displacement of their own personality into this doll figure. They are cartoons. And I think if we make that connection, that link, that's what makes them so horrifying to Fawcett and to Howard. And that's the connection with the Khmer Rouge. One other thing I think I want to mention here is the last thing about the story is this idea of subliminal messaging. If you remember, Howard thinks that he can hear, is it a Nazi march under a Pink Floyd song? This is subliminal messaging. And I think that's the kind of thing that Fawcett's concerned about. It almost takes us back into the cave, the Platonic cave. Look at the message here, the subliminal message. It's given to us in italics on page 196. At the top here, the site, Expo 86, is full of comic book technology and a lot of bright color and weird kind of compulsory optimism. It's really just Disneyland, all low content entertainment and bullshit. The real message is, don't you worry about a thing. And the more, Fawcett's arguing, the more we consume that message, the more we become complacent, spectators, non-participants, and potentially victims. So there we are. That's his thesis. Let me turn now to your essay, which is probably the thing you most want to hear me talking about. Okay. The question, I'm going to put this in writing for you and post it on eLearn on the day of your next scheduled class. But the question is this, basically. You scribbled it down here. Drawing on McLuhan's metaphor of the global village, Fawcett argues that the practices of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1970s are somehow being mirrored by elite groups today in North America. Is this a reasonable parallel to make? Is this a reasonable analogy? Or, to put it simply, do you agree with Fawcett? Some of you right now will be nodding yes, absolutely. Some of you will be saying no, the guy's a complete idiot. And some of you will be saying yes and no. That's your thesis. Your answer to that question is your thesis. So, okay, how will you go about writing this essay? What I suggest is that you begin with a definition of the global village. I've given it to you. You can find it. It's easy enough. Just Google it. You'll find a definition. I would provide that, or begin with something like that. Take me then to the 3 stories that you're going to write about. Remember, one from the beginning of the book, stories 1 to 6, one from the middle, 7 to 10, one from the end of the book, 11 to 13. So tell me what the 3 stories are, and then at the end of your first paragraph, give me your thesis, your position, your response to the question. Then it's easy, right? You just take me through each of your stories, your 3 stories. So you might write a paragraph or 2 about the first story that you want to deal with. Try not to just give plot description, try to analyze it and try to make connections the way I have done with the subtext. Once you've done that, go to your next story. Once you've done that, go to your final story. And then maybe write a conclusion. That's up to you. And whether you put a title to your essay is also up to you. That's it. I think it's actually pretty easy in terms of structure. So I'll write 1 or 2 other sort of details about, you can write in first person and stuff like that. But let me just say this as a final point on this essay. If you simply regurgitate what I have said in these videos, that's okay. That's fine. I know some of you are stressing out about this and worried, oh my God, what can I do? If you regurgitate, just repeat everything I've said in these videos about your story, and use my examples from the subtext, whatever, and you do it in a grammatically correct, well-organized essay, you will pass this assignment. More than that, you'll get a good grade, like a B or a B+. Yeah, it's that easy. So relax. Relax. It's that easy. All you've got to do is just go through the videos, right? But if you do that, you won't get an A. And I know that there are several among you who are capable of really top marks and want top marks. So what do you do to get an A? Answer, go beyond what I've said in the videos. And that actually is a tip for all your classes at Capilano and elsewhere, at least in the humanities. You need to try and go beyond what your instructor is saying. What do I mean by that? Answer, research. So that's the challenge. That's the gauntlet I'm laying down. If you want that A+, you need to now decide to do some research. So what would you research? Well, why don't you start with the global village? Why don't you start with Marshall McLuhan? Why don't you... you can find quotes, academic quotes. You can find statistics. It will kind of depend on the stories that you choose to write about. But you can do this if you decide to do it. And if you decide to do it, make sure you then use proper MLA citation or APA citation. It should start becoming just second nature to you as you work through university. So again, I repeat, you don't have to do that at all. But if you want to, that's what you need to do to get the top marks. And I suppose I should say in passing that if you fill your essay with wonderful academic quotes, but it is filled with grammatical errors, then I'm afraid you're not going to be getting an A, are you? So you need to be doing everything really well to get that really top grade. Okay, enough from me about Cambodia, and enough from me generally, I think. The final week in this course is going to be given to you to be working on your assignments, your presentations, and your research essay, and indeed this essay. But again, I'll write more about that through to your email. And I guess that's it now in terms of me speaking into this camera here. It's unfortunate that we never had a chance to meet, but maybe we will. Maybe we will down the track. If you come into one of my other classes, I'll be delighted to see you there. Okay, so on that note, bye for now.